Welcome back to Lore at Night, where rain gently falls and every story carries a shadow. I'm always curious to hear where in the world you're listening from, so comment that down below. Now get comfortable, and let's begin with the first story. The first object logged into evidence was a ring of keys found resting in a shallow indentation of frozen mud. They were not hidden. They lay where a hand had let go, teeth of metal pressed into earth. What drew attention to them was not the shine of steel or the mark they left in the soil, but the behavior of a dog that refused to move on. The call came in just after dawn from a local resident walking his retriever along a narrow strip of municipal parkland that traced the eastern edge of the Raritan River in New Jersey. The park saw little foot traffic in winter. It existed mostly as a buffer between the river and an aging industrial corridor of warehouses, scrap yards, and shuttered loading bays. The dog had pulled hard toward the water, lowering its head, circling a patch of ground near a stand of reeds, then stopping altogether. It would not respond to commands. When the owner stepped closer, he saw the keys half pressed into the mud. There was no blood. No clothing, no sign of violence that could be identified at a glance. The owner took a photograph with his phone, then called the local police department. By the time officers arrived, frost still clung to the shaded ground, and the river moved slowly, opaque and indifferent, carrying small fragments of debris downstream. Yellow tape went up within the hour. The air smelled of wet iron and decaying vegetation. Bare trees leaned toward the water, their branches thin and brittle. Beyond them, rusted chain-link fencing traced the outline of forgotten properties. The keys were photographed in place, then bagged. There were impressions in the soil nearby, shallow and indistinct, suggesting someone had stood there longer than a moment. Whether that presence was deliberate or uncertain could not be determined. By mid-morning, the keys had been identified. They belonged to Pierce Jackson, age 45, a civil engineer employed by a regional infrastructure consulting firm based in Edison. Pierce lived alone in a rented townhouse, less than 5 miles from the riverbank. When officers went to the address, they found his car parked neatly in its assigned space, locked, untouched. The front door of the townhouse was secured from the outside. Inside, the rooms were orderly. There were no signs of a hurried departure, no packed bags, no notes. Pierce had not come into work the previous day. For most employees, that might not have registered immediately. For Pierce, it stood out. He was methodical to the point of predictability. He arrived early, left late, and rarely deviated from routine without advance notice. When he did not answer his phone or respond to emails, a supervisor marked the absence as unusual but not yet alarming. Pierce had accrued vacation time. He often spoke about needing rest, though he almost never took it. When detectives contacted the firm, they learned that Pierce had been working extended hours for several months on a transportation assessment connected to a proposed redevelopment project along the river. The site encompassed a neglected stretch of infrastructure, abandoned rail spurs, utility access roads, and warehouses long stripped of commercial purpose. Much of Pierce's work involved field verification, walking sections of the property to confirm the accuracy of decades-old plans. The stretch of riverbank where the keys were found fell squarely within the project boundary. Search teams returned to the park and moved outward in careful, widening arcs. The terrain was uneven, marked by remnants of past construction and erosion. Reeds and low brush interrupted sight lines. Footprints appeared and vanished with frustrating inconsistency, some recent, others softened by cycles of thaw and refreeze. None could be conclusively matched to Pierce. As the afternoon wore on, the search expanded beyond the park, following access roads and informal paths that cut through the industrial lots. There was still no sign of Pierce Jackson. Only the keys remained, silent and ordinary, waiting to be explained. As daylight faded, attention shifted from the riverbank to the timeline of Pierce Jackson's last known movements. Credit card records showed a routine pattern: gas purchased 3 days earlier near his townhouse, groceries the same evening, no activity after that. His phone last connected to a cell tower shortly after 9, the night before his absence was noticed, the signal placing him within a broad radius that included both his home and the industrial corridor along the river. The phone itself remained unaccounted for. Investigators walked the redevelopment site with project maps in hand, comparing clean lines on paper to what remained on the ground. Some access roads were barely passable, reduced to rutted paths through weeds and broken asphalt. Others ended abruptly at locked gates or collapsed fencing. The area had once been busy with freight traffic and utility crews, but decades of partial abandonment had left it fragmented and poorly documented. For someone unfamiliar, it was easy to take a wrong turn. For someone like Pierce, who prided himself on precision, getting lost seemed unlikely. Colleagues described him as quiet, but not withdrawn, cautious without being timid. He was known to double-check measurements, to walk a site twice if something did not align. That habit, normally an asset, now complicated the picture. It meant he could have lingered anywhere along the riverfront without raising suspicion. It also meant he might have noticed something others overlooked. By evening, search teams suspended ground operations. The temperature dropped quickly, hardening the mud along the river's edge. The keys had already been transported to evidence, cataloged, photographed, and set aside. They told a simple story. Pierce had been there. At some point, he had removed them from his pocket or belt loop. What they did not explain was why they were left behind. Back at his townhouse, officers returned for a second look. They noted small details that had seemed insignificant earlier. A pair of boots by the door, their soles still carrying dried grit consistent with riverbank soil. A folded site map on the kitchen counter, corners worn soft from repeated handling. Several sections were marked with pencil notes, light enough to suggest hesitation rather than emphasis. One area along the river was circled, then crossed out, then circled again. There was no indication that Pierce had planned to disappear. His refrigerator held food that would spoil within days. His calendar listed a dentist appointment scheduled for the following week. An alarm was set on his phone for an early morning hour, the same time he rose every workday. Routine surrounded him, intact and unbroken, ending only at the moment he failed to return. As night settled over the river, the water continued its slow movement past darkened warehouses and empty docks. Somewhere along its edge, Pierce Jackson had stopped long enough to remove his keys. Whether he had done so deliberately, distracted by a problem that demanded attention, or compelled by something unseen remained unanswered. The search would resume at first light, but for now the case rested on a narrow strip of frozen ground and an absence that was already beginning to feel deliberate. The following morning, the search resumed under a low gray sky that flattened the landscape and dulled contrast. Volunteers joined law enforcement along the perimeter, their presence adding noise and motion but little clarity. Dogs were brought in, working from the location where the keys had been found, but the scent trail degraded quickly. The riverbank offered too many interruptions. Water, metal, oil residue, and old refuse combined into a confusing palette that resisted clean interpretation. Each handler reached the same conclusion by midday. Whatever path Pierce Jackson had taken from that spot, it did not extend far on foot. That assessment shifted focus back to the river itself. A shallow draft boat traced the near shoreline while officers scanned the surface and banks downstream. The water was cold enough to slow decomposition, but not still enough to preserve evidence. Debris collected along bends where current slackened, and those areas were examined carefully. Nothing surfaced that day. No clothing, no personal items, no sign that a body had entered the water nearby. The absence cut both ways. It did not confirm drowning, but it did not rule it out. Investigators began canvassing the industrial properties bordering the redevelopment zone. Most were owned by shell companies or absentee landlords. Several structures were unsecured, their doors hanging loose or blocked by debris. Inside, the buildings were stripped nearly to their frames. Copper wiring had been pulled years earlier. Windows were broken or boarded. Floors were uneven, some softened by rot. These spaces had become informal shelters at times, places where people passed through but rarely stayed long. Nothing inside suggested recent activity connected to Pierce. No fresh footprints, no discarded tools, no evidence of an accident. The silence inside those buildings felt long established, not newly disturbed. As hours passed, investigators noted a subtle tension in the case that had not yet been articulated. Pierce's disappearance did not behave like a sudden crisis. There was no obvious point of violence, no clear hazard site, no signal of panic. What remained instead was a sense of interruption, as if something ordinary had been paused mid-motion. That impression deepened when his computer was examined. Work files were open and saved methodically. Emails were drafted but not sent, their content routine and procedural. One document stood out only because of how little it differed from the rest. A field report had been updated late the previous evening, time-stamped less than an hour before his phone last connected to the network. The changes were minor, a corrected measurement, a brief note about an access road that no longer aligned with historical records. The tone was neutral. There was no indication of concern. Investigators mapped Pierce's known habits against the geography of the site. He preferred to walk alone. He parked in predictable locations. He favored routes that allowed him to verify multiple features in a single pass. That narrowed the field to a handful of plausible paths, all of which had now been searched. By the third day, the case drew quiet attention within the department. Resources were reassigned. The search perimeter widened again, this time upstream, where the river narrowed and the banks steepened. Still, nothing emerged. What remained most unsettling was the simplicity of the evidence. Keys placed or dropped. A man who left his home as if he intended to return. A work site that offered no clear explanation for disappearance. Each new hour without discovery did not complicate the story. It stripped it further, leaving behind a single unresolved question that investigators had begun to ask without voicing it aloud. If Pierce Jackson had not fallen into the river and had not been taken by force, then he had left that riverbank by some other means. The keys, resting where they were found, suggested a decision made at that exact point. Whatever followed had carried him away cleanly enough to leave nothing behind. Late on the third afternoon, an overlooked detail returned to the center of the investigation. It came not from the river or the buildings, but from a review of traffic data collected for an unrelated municipal study. A temporary camera had been installed months earlier at an intersection feeding into the industrial corridor, intended to measure commercial vehicle flow. The footage was low resolution and intermittent, capturing short bursts rather than continuous streams. It had not been examined initially because the camera faced away from the river itself. When technicians isolated the relevant time window, they found Pierce Jackson's car entering the corridor the evening before his disappearance. That much aligned with expectation. What unsettled investigators was what followed. The car did not leave. Between 7 and 10 that night, the camera recorded several vehicles exiting the area. Delivery trucks, a tow vehicle, 2 private cars. Pierce's sedan did not appear among them. There were only 2 possibilities. Either the car had remained parked somewhere beyond the camera's field of view, or it had exited through one of the lesser access points that were not monitored. Those routes were narrow, poorly marked, and in some cases technically closed, but they existed. Teams returned to the site with this new frame of reference. They located the area where Pierce typically parked during field visits, a gravel turnout near a collapsed fence line. The space was empty. Tire impressions were faint but present, compressed into frozen ground. They could not be dated precisely, but they suggested recent use. This raised a quiet but consequential shift in thinking. Pierce had arrived at the site by car, but he might not have left it there. The keys found by the river now carried added weight, if they were his car keys. Their presence near the water implied separation from the vehicle, rather than abandonment of it. Someone had driven the car away, or Pierce himself had left on foot and arranged for the car to be removed later. Neither option fit easily. Investigators searched impound records and tow logs. Nothing matched. Nearby businesses were contacted again, this time with photographs of Pierce's car. No one recalled seeing it moved. No license plate readers along major roads flagged it leaving the area. The car had not resurfaced. That absence sharpened the edges of the case. It introduced coordination where there had been none. A disappearance without a vehicle is ambiguous. A disappearance with a missing vehicle suggests planning, assistance, or intervention. As evening approached, detectives stood again at the riverbank, where the keys had been found. The light was thin and colorless. The waterline had shifted slightly since the initial discovery, erasing some impressions while exposing others. The spot itself remained unremarkable, a place that would never draw attention without reason. Somewhere between that frozen patch of mud and the unaccounted route out of the corridor, Pierce Jackson's routine had broken. The evidence suggested he had not panicked. He had not fled blindly. Whatever occurred had unfolded with enough control to leave behind only what he could afford to lose. The search would continue, but the investigation had crossed a threshold. This was no longer a matter of locating a missing man along a river. It was a matter of understanding how someone methodical and cautious could vanish so completely, leaving behind a single deliberate absence where certainty should have been. By the fourth day, Pierce Jackson's disappearance had been recategorized internally. The language around the case changed in small, telling ways. Search briefings became investigative briefings. The river remained on the map, but it stopped being the centerpiece. The missing car took that place, because vehicles are harder to erase than people unless someone is willing to spend effort and accept risk. Detectives began with what Pierce had touched last. His field files were pulled from the firm's server and mirrored against what he kept at home. The work was unglamorous, a slow comparison of versions and timestamps, but it produced the first meaningful asymmetry. Pierce had been maintaining two parallel sets of notes. One was the formal report stream, clean and procedural. The other was a private folder on his laptop, unlabeled and buried beneath innocuous directory names. Inside were photographs taken at odd angles, close to the ground, with handwritten measurements on scraps of paper laid beside cracks in asphalt and patches of stained soil. The photographs were not artistic. They were evidentiary. They showed a service road whose shoulder had collapsed into a shallow sink, exposing dark fill beneath. They showed a series of capped pipes emerging from the earth behind a warehouse whose address no longer appeared on current planning documents. They showed rainbow sheen pooled in rainwater along a trench line and a cluster of warning placards, sun-faded, partially torn away. The images were dated over several weeks. Pierce had not sent them to his supervisors. That alone was unusual. Pierce was not the type to sit on findings that affected engineering recommendations. If he documented a discrepancy, he pushed it into the record. The private nature of these images suggested hesitation, or the possibility that he had already tried to raise concerns and found the channel unreceptive. The detective assigned to liaison with the consulting firm learned quickly that the redevelopment project had become politically sensitive. Local officials wanted it to move forward. The developer was well connected, and the corridor's blight had been a talking point for years. The environmental component of the plan was supposedly complete, its risks assessed, its remediation budgeted. Pierce's private photos implied that something remained, something inconvenient. Investigators requested access to the project's stakeholder list and began making calls. Pierce's direct manager described him as dependable, sometimes rigid, and increasingly strained in the weeks before he vanished. Pierce had asked for additional time on site visits, citing inconsistencies between historical maps and current conditions. The manager had approved some of it, but not all. The schedule was tight. The client wanted deliverables. The developer's representatives offered the kind of cooperation that reads as compliance, while giving little away. They provided general timelines. They confirmed that contracted security made rounds at night. They insisted the site was largely inactive after hours, with a few exceptions for equipment staging and utility work. They denied knowledge of Pierce being on the property that evening, though they acknowledged it was not unusual for engineers to conduct field verification late. A more revealing set of facts came from a place that rarely shows on television: the logistics of access control. The redevelopment zone had several gates, most neglected, a few actively used. One gate, at the far southern edge near an old spur line, was electronically logged because it protected equipment the developers still cared about. The access system recorded key fob entries, timestamps, and whether the gate was opened by a fob or forced manually. On the night Pierce disappeared, the gate opened twice within an hour. The first entry was logged under a security contractor. The second, 42 minutes later, was logged under a site supervisor employed by a subcontractor responsible for demolition prep. Neither name matched Pierce. Neither man reported seeing him. When detectives requested the security patrol logs, they found something else that did not belong. A handwritten addendum, stapled to the end of the shift report, noted a, quote, minor trespass issue near the river path. No police contact was recorded, no incident number, just a vague line about an unidentified person who left the area. The wording was too polished to be casual, and too vague to be useful. It read like something written to exist on paper rather than to communicate. At the same time, Pierce's phone records produced a thin thread. His phone had received a call at 8:37 p.m. the night he vanished. The call lasted 12 seconds. It came from a prepaid number that had no subscriber information, the kind that lives briefly and then disappears. That number had pinged 2 towers, both within a narrow band that overlapped the industrial corridor. It was the first sign that Pierce had interacted with someone that night. Investigators returned to the site again, this time with a narrower target. They focused on the area indicated by Pierce's circled map, the place he had marked, crossed out, and marked again. It was not on the riverbank itself. It was a cut through the brush that led to the back of a warehouse, whose loading bays faced away from the main access road. The building's official address had been reassigned years earlier, and the old signage was gone. Its walls were patched with mismatched panels, as if sections had been replaced after some prior incident. Inside, the floor was littered with broken pallets and the dry remnants of insulation. The air held the stale sweetness of old fuel. There were no fresh footprints, but there were drag marks in the dust, faint and partial, leading toward a corner where the concrete had been repaired with a newer pour. The patch was uneven, its surface slightly darker than the surrounding slab. A cadaver dog showed interest there, then moved away, then returned, and sat. The handler did not treat it as conclusive, but the reaction was consistent enough to justify a warrant. When the warrant was signed, the detectives had what they needed to shift the case fully from missing person to suspected homicide, even without a body. They also had a new urgency. If Pierce had been taken and concealed on site, the redevelopment work itself threatened to erase what remained. The next morning, a forensic team arrived with ground-penetrating radar equipment and a coring drill. The warehouse was quiet, sealed off from public view, the kind of place where a small group could work for hours without drawing attention. The radar sweep produced an anomaly beneath the newer concrete patch, a void or disruption inconsistent with standard subgrade. The drill bit began to cut. Within minutes, it brought up wet gray material that smelled faintly chemical, and beneath it, a strand of synthetic fabric caught on the spiral. Not enough to identify, not enough to declare victory, but enough to make the room go very still. That afternoon, while the warehouse floor was being prepared for excavation, a call came in from a neighboring municipality. A patrol unit had located a burned-out sedan at the edge of a wooded retention basin near an access road that fed into a different part of the corridor. The plate was gone. The vehicle identification number was partially melted but recoverable. It was Pierce Jackson's car. The car's interior told a story of haste masquerading as thoroughness. The seats were scorched in irregular patterns, the kind produced by accelerant poured quickly rather than carefully applied. The glove compartment had been left open, its contents reduced to a damp ash slurry. The trunk was burned too, but not as intensely, suggesting whoever lit the fire had prioritized the cabin where personal traces were most likely to exist. Even so, fire does not erase everything. It changes the form of evidence, and it sometimes makes other things easier to see. A forensic technician recovered a warped set of metal fragments from the center console area, likely the remains of Pierce's phone mount. More importantly, they recovered a partial imprint on the driver's side floor, protected beneath a layer of melted rubber mat. It was a tread pattern different from Pierce's shoes, broader, with a distinctive triangular lug design. The print was incomplete, but it was enough to compare against common work boots. They also found something that did not belong in a burned car left in a muddy basin. A small fleck of bright blue paint embedded in the driver's door frame, as if the car had brushed hard against a painted metal surface before the fire. The paint was industrial, thick and glossy. Investigators connected that clue to the redevelopment site, where several pieces of heavy equipment were painted the same blue used by a specific regional contractor. It was a small step, but it tightened the circle. At the warehouse, excavation began under controlled conditions. The newer concrete patch was cut in sections and lifted. Beneath it was fill that looked recently disturbed. As the soil was removed in thin layers, the odor became sharper, a mix of damp earth and petroleum. The dog's earlier interest made grim sense. What emerged was not a full body. It was worse in a way that was harder to describe without slipping into spectacle. The remains had been fragmented, wrapped in contractor-grade plastic, and embedded alongside other refuse, as if someone had attempted to treat a human presence as construction waste. The condition of the remains suggested both mechanical force and time spent in a chemically harsh environment. The medical examiner could not provide an immediate identity from what was recovered. Dental records were not an option. Fingerprints were gone. But there were clothing fibers consistent with the fabric caught by the drill, and there was a watch, its face cracked, its band still clasped. Pierce Jackson's family confirmed the watch from photographs. With confirmation came motive hunting, the part of the case that rarely offers clean answers. Pierce had no known enemies, no active disputes, no domestic partner with a history of volatility. His financial records were steady. No gambling, no sudden withdrawals, nothing that suggested he planned to vanish or had been targeted for money. The motive that remained was the one suggested by his hidden photographs: knowledge. the kind that could delay a project, cost millions, and implicate people who had assured officials that everything was already handled. Detectives subpoenaed internal emails from the developer and key subcontractors. They also obtained Pierce's work communications, looking for points where he might have raised concerns. What they found was subtle but telling. Pierce had sent a carefully worded message to his manager 2 weeks earlier, noting unmapped utility features and possible legacy contamination indicators near the river path, with a request for additional environmental review. His manager had forwarded it to a client contact. The client contact responded with a brief note urging the team to stay in scope and avoid unnecessary delays. Pierce had not replied. Instead, he had begun keeping private evidence. The prepaid number that called him the night he vanished became the next focus. Investigators could not tie it to a subscriber, but they could tie it to movement. Tower pings placed the phone within the corridor that evening, then later near the retention basin where Pierce's car was found. The phone went dark shortly after midnight and never reappeared. A second break came from an old technology that still solves modern cases: toll records. Pierce's car, before it was burned, had crossed a local toll bridge at 10:11 p.m. the night he disappeared. The toll tag was registered to Pierce, but the plate had been captured by a grainy roadside camera. The image was enough to confirm the vehicle. The direction of travel was away from the river corridor and toward a cluster of industrial yards where cars were sometimes stripped for parts. That created a plausible chain. Pierce had arrived at the redevelopment site. Something happened. His car was moved, likely by someone else. It was driven to a different location, then eventually dumped and burned in a place chosen for privacy rather than efficiency. Investigators began pulling surveillance footage from any business facing the route between the corridor and the toll crossing. Most cameras were cheap, badly angled, or overwritten. But one small warehouse supply store had a system that archived longer, and its parking lot camera captured the road beyond the chain-link fence. At 9:58 p.m., Pierce's sedan passed in the frame. At 10:01 p.m., a blue-painted piece of equipment followed on a flatbed trailer, the tow vehicle driven by a man in a reflective jacket. The flatbed side rails carried fresh scrapes where paint had been disturbed. The connection to the blue paint fleck in Pierce's car became more than coincidence. The flatbed was traced to a subcontractor responsible for equipment staging. Their supervisor claimed the rig had been parked that night. His time card said he left at 7 p.m. Security logs showed his fob entry at the southern gate later than that. The patrol addendum, the one noting a, quote, minor trespass issue, was signed by the same security contractor whose fob opened the gate first. It was a web of small lies, each one constructed to cover a short interval. Detectives brought both men in separately. There were no confrontations on record, no dramatic admissions, only a gradual tightening as inconsistencies were placed side by side. The supervisor's account shifted first, then shifted again. He began to frame the night as a misunderstanding, a scare tactic gone wrong, an attempt to keep an engineer from slowing a project. The security contractor held longer. His story stayed tidy until confronted with the toll record, the camera image, and the fob entries. Eventually, he conceded a core truth without providing the full narrative. Pierce had been on site. Pierce had been approached. Pierce had been taken into the warehouse near the river path. The reason, he suggested, was to talk him out of escalating concerns. The remains under the concrete patch suggested that whatever began as persuasion ended as something else entirely. When the district attorney authorized arrest warrants, the detectives still lacked one crucial piece. They could not yet prove who delivered the fatal blow, or whether the death was planned from the start. Without that, the case could fracture into blame shifting, each participant claiming the worst act belonged to someone else. That final clarity arrived from a place Pierce had never considered: a device he barely used. His work-issued GPS unit, kept in his trunk for site mapping, had been synced automatically to a cloud account when it reconnected to a network. The unit had continued logging after Pierce stopped moving, because it had been carried with the equipment used to move his car. The GPS trail did not go to the retention basin first. It went to the warehouse by the river, then to a demolition staging yard, then to a concrete batch site, then out toward the toll crossing. It created a sequence so specific that it left little room for alternative explanations. The next step was to match that sequence to a person with authority over those locations. And there was one name that appeared across all of them, not as a laborer, not as a contractor, but as the coordinator who signed off on night access, equipment movement, and concrete pours. His name was Stephen Ward. Stephen Ward was not visible at the scene the way a stranger with a weapon would be. His role was administrative, the kind that rarely shows in early press releases. He was the redevelopment coordinator for the developer's project, responsible for keeping subcontractors aligned and problems contained. He attended meetings with city officials. He managed timelines. He signed access requests and approved after-hours equipment staging. He also had a history that did not appear in public summaries. Years earlier, Ward had been part of a different project that ran into environmental complications, the kind that cost time and money and left fingerprints in the form of lawsuits. None of it had resulted in criminal charges, but it had taught him a practical lesson about what happens when contamination becomes official. Pierce Jackson's private folder suggested that official status was exactly where things were headed. Investigators rebuilt the night of the disappearance using the GPS trail, the gate logs, toll data, and the warehouse supply store footage. It produced a coherent chain. Pierce arrived at the site after hours to verify something he could not reconcile on paper. The circled area on his kitchen map matched the location of the capped pipes and the stained soil documented in his photographs. He likely intended to confirm and photograph it again, then decide whether to escalate formally. The prepaid call at 8:37 p.m. was used to draw him in. Investigators could not prove the content of the call, but they did not need to. The call's timing and location placed it as a trigger, a small nudge that moved Pierce toward the warehouse rather than back to his car. At the warehouse, Pierce was confronted by the security contractor and the equipment staging supervisor. Their statements, though self-serving, aligned on one point. Ward had instructed them to handle the situation, to keep Pierce from creating a record that would force an environmental stoppage. The plan, as they described it later, was to intimidate Pierce and take his phone long enough to delete photographs. What happened next was reconstructed not through confession but through physical details. A blood pattern was found beneath the warehouse's older slab edge, sealed under dust and residue, the kind of trace that survives because no one thinks to look under the place they patch. A fragment of Pierce's watch face matched the brake line on the watch recovered in the fill. The medical examiner concluded from the recovered remains that Pierce sustained a blunt force injury consistent with a fall and impact against a hard edge. It suggested an escalation that may not have been planned in those exact terms, but that still occurred within a scenario built on coercion. After Pierce was incapacitated, the group moved quickly. His keys were separated from his person and left near the river path to seed a narrative of drowning. His phone was removed, then destroyed. His car was driven out using a route that avoided the traffic study camera, then moved through the toll crossing toward a stripping yard. The blue paint transfer in the door frame matched a scrape along the flatbed trailer rail, indicating the sedan had been loaded roughly, likely after being repositioned. The most damning act was the concealment. Ward authorized an after-hours concrete pour at the warehouse under the pretense of stabilizing a damaged slab. The batch site confirmed an unscheduled order that night, small enough to avoid attention, billed under a generic line item. The staging yard logs showed equipment movement consistent with lifting and placing heavy material. The ground-penetrating radar anomaly aligned with the timing of that pour. Pierce's remains were hidden beneath the patch, mixed with construction waste to obscure density and pattern, then sealed in place. It was an attempt to make the disappearance feel natural, a man lost to river or misadventure. The missing car and the burned shell were meant to remove the easiest link between Pierce and the site. The keys were meant to give the public a simple conclusion. The case unraveled because the participants treated systems like paper. They assumed logs were flexible and cameras were forgetful. They assumed that a man who vanished would not leave behind a private archive that explained why someone might want him silent. Ward was arrested at his home 2 weeks after Pierce Jackson was reported missing. The security contractor and equipment supervisor were arrested the same day. The charges varied, reflecting levels of participation, but the central allegation was clear. Pierce had been killed during an attempted coercion, and his death had been concealed through coordinated misuse of the redevelopment site. In the end, the most accurate summary of what happened to Pierce was also the simplest. He noticed something that could not be allowed into the record, and the effort to keep it quiet turned into a crime that required increasingly desperate choices to maintain. The redevelopment project halted immediately under court order. Pierce's name appeared briefly in official statements, then mostly in filings and evidence logs, attached to photographs and measurements he took alone, doing the job the way he always did, methodical and precise, until the moment routine became leverage. Now let's get into the next story for tonight. At 3:17 a.m., the motion sensor in Gallery 4 registered movement that did not belong to any known pattern. It was not abrupt enough to trigger an alarm escalation, nor slow enough to be dismissed as a mechanical fault. The system logged it as incidental, the kind of anomaly that accumulated quietly in back-end reports, and was reviewed weeks later, if at all. By the time the museum opened the following morning, the room appeared unchanged. The lights came on as scheduled. The temperature held steady. The glass cases reflected the same pale glow they always had. It was not until a docent noticed the silence that anyone understood something was wrong. Gallery 4 housed objects meant to draw the eye gradually. Visitors usually slowed as they moved through it, leaning closer to read placards, pausing to absorb details that resisted quick consumption. That morning, the room repelled attention instead. People walked through faster than usual. They did not linger. The cases looked full, but the space felt thinner, as if depth itself had been reduced. The first confirmed absence was small. A palm-sized ceremonial blade from the Pacific Northwest, its obsidian edge dulled by age, sat in a cradle of clear acrylic. Or rather, it had. The cradle remained. The blade did not. There were no chips in the case, no disturbed dust. The locking mechanism showed no sign of tampering. When curators expanded the inspection, the scope of the loss widened with unnerving speed. 37 items were missing. They were not the most valuable pieces in the collection, at least not by insurance standards. No gold, no jewels, nothing that would headline a stolen art bulletin. Instead, the missing objects shared a subtler connection. They were all artifacts whose significance lay in context rather than spectacle. Tools, fragments, personal items. Things that carried meaning only when understood properly. A bone needle. A trade bead. A carved whistle with a cracked mouthpiece. Each one had been catalogued carefully, photographed, described, and placed where it fit within a broader story of human movement and adaptation. Security footage deepened the confusion. Cameras showed no intruder entering or leaving the gallery. No staff member lingered longer than scheduled. The night guard completed his rounds without deviation. The access logs recorded no after-hours entries. Yet the objects were gone, removed with such precision that even curators struggled to identify exactly when absence replaced presence. The museum occupied a renovated federal building near the river, its stone facade imposing but its interior softened by modern glass and open sightlines. It prided itself on accessibility, on the idea that history should feel close rather than remote. That philosophy had shaped its security as well. Barriers were subtle. Alarms were calibrated to avoid disruption. The theft exploited that balance with unnerving accuracy. Investigators initially suspected an inside job, but the staff list yielded no obvious candidate. Curators were specialists, protective of their domains to the point of possessiveness. Guards were underpaid but stable, many having worked there for years. No one showed signs of sudden wealth or agitation. More importantly, no one seemed to know exactly what had been taken. The missing items had been chosen from across multiple displays, each selection precise but not obvious. The breakthrough came not from what was missing, but from what remained. In one case, a clay vessel sat slightly off-center, rotated just enough to reveal a faint mark on the felt beneath it. A circular indentation, clean and fresh. It suggested that something else had rested there recently, something round and slightly heavier than the vessel itself. That object had not been listed as missing because it had never been on display. It had been placed there temporarily during a cataloging update and forgotten. The realization shifted the investigation's frame. This was not a theft aimed at the public-facing collection. It was a targeted removal of objects in transition, items that existed briefly outside their formal records. Someone had known which artifacts were between states, present but not fully accounted for. Someone had understood the museum not as a static space, but as a living system with moments of vulnerability. As curators retraced recent internal movements, a pattern emerged. Each missing object had been handled within the same 6-week window. Each had passed through the same preparation room. Each had been signed out for study, conservation, or photography, then returned to display without fanfare. The thief had not needed to break in. They had only needed to be present long enough to observe. What unsettled investigators most was restraint. Nothing extraneous had been disturbed. No message had been left behind. The theft announced itself only through absence, and even then, reluctantly. It suggested a collector rather than a reseller, someone motivated by coherence rather than profit. The objects formed a quiet constellation, one that made sense only to someone who understood their shared lineage. By the end of the week, the museum closed Gallery 4 to the public. Press releases emphasized routine maintenance. Internally, staff moved through the space with new caution, aware that familiarity had been used against them. The missing artifacts were entered into national databases, but few expected a quick recovery. The crime had not been loud enough to attract immediate attention, and that, investigators believed, had been the point. The theft did not feel complete. It felt paused. Whatever story the objects told together, it had not yet reached its final chapter. The closure of Gallery 4 altered the museum's internal rhythm more than anyone expected. Without visitors passing through, the space felt exposed, its glass cases now reflecting only staff moving cautiously along the perimeter. Conservators returned objects to storage that would normally have remained on display, not because they were threatened, but because the idea of leaving anything unattended had become intolerable. The theft had shifted trust, not just in security systems, but in the assumption that knowledge itself stayed put. The investigative team assigned to the case approached it as a problem of sequence rather than force. If no clear moment of intrusion existed, then the removal must have occurred during normal operations. That narrowed the window but expanded the cast. Dozens of people had legitimate access during the 6-week period identified by curators. Interns, visiting researchers, external contractors. volunteers rotating through visitor services. The museum's openness, once a point of pride, now felt like an unguarded flank. Investigators began reconstructing object movement with a forensic level of attention usually reserved for major art thefts. They traced every handling log, every sign-out sheet, every digital timestamp attached to photographs and condition reports. The work was slow and exacting. Museums generate documentation constantly, but not always consistently. Handwritten notes were scanned late. Emails referenced objects by nicknames rather than catalog numbers. The thief, whoever they were, had moved through this imperfect system without leaving a clear trace, relying on the gaps between intention and execution. A subtle irregularity emerged in the photography records. Over a 3-week span, several objects from different collections had been photographed under identical lighting conditions, despite belonging to departments that normally scheduled imaging separately. The metadata showed the same camera body and lens, the same color calibration profile, and the same backdrop wear marks. This was not unusual in isolation. Equipment was shared, rooms were reused. But the clustering was too tight to ignore. The photographer assigned during that period was experienced and well regarded, a contractor who had worked with the museum intermittently for years. His role was technical rather than curatorial. He followed instructions, captured what was placed in front of him, and delivered files on time. When interviewed, he appeared cooperative and unperturbed. He remembered the objects only vaguely, describing them as small, difficult to light, and not especially distinctive. That lack of impression did not raise suspicion. It reinforced it. More revealing was the staging of the images themselves. The missing artifacts had been photographed at slightly different angles than standard protocol dictated. The deviations were minor, almost stylistic. A bead rotated a few degrees to show drill marks. A blade tilted to catch edge wear. These choices suggested an eye trained not just to document, but to study. Someone had wanted the images to capture use, not just form. Investigators compared the stolen objects as a group for the first time, laying out their descriptions, dimensions, and known origins. On the surface, they appeared disparate, drawn from cultures separated by geography and centuries. But when a research analyst overlaid trade route data and migration timelines, a quieter connection appeared. Each object represented a point of cultural exchange rather than isolation. Tools adapted from other regions. Materials sourced through contact. Forms that changed subtly after encounter. The thief, it seemed, was assembling a narrative rather than a collection. This reframing shifted investigative priorities. Instead of asking who could steal from the museum, the question became who would want these specific intersections. Scholars, collectors, smugglers, and ideologues all surfaced as possibilities, but none fit cleanly. Black market demand tended towards spectacle and value. Private collectors sought completeness within narrow categories. The selection here resisted easy display. Its power lay in interpretation. As days passed, the absence began to echo beyond the museum. A university researcher contacted curators after noticing a discrepancy in a recently accessed database. An object he had cited in a draft paper now appeared in archival photos, but not in updated records. He assumed a clerical error until told otherwise. Similar messages followed. The theft had begun to ripple outward, touching people who engaged with the collection only abstractly. Then came the first sign that the objects were not simply gone. A small regional museum 3 states away reported receiving an unsolicited package containing a single artifact. It was one of the missing items, the bone needle, carefully wrapped and accompanied by no explanation. The institution contacted authorities immediately. Forensic analysis yielded nothing useful. No fingerprints. No fibers that could not be traced to common materials. The needle itself showed no new damage, no signs of handling beyond what it had already accumulated over centuries. What unsettled investigators was timing. The package arrived less than 24 hours after Gallery 4 closed. Whoever sent it knew the internal response schedule. They understood how quickly absence would be noticed, how soon pressure would build. The return felt calibrated, a controlled release designed to confirm possession rather than relinquish it. The needle's reappearance reframed the theft as an ongoing dialogue. The thief was not hiding. They were pacing the revelation. As the museum quietly increased security and investigators expanded their net, a shared unease settled over everyone involved. The objects had been taken because they mattered together. Returning one disrupted the integrity of that set, unless the disruption itself was part of the message. The question was no longer whether the remaining artifacts would resurface, but in what order, and toward what end. By the close of the second week, the investigation reached a fragile equilibrium. Leads existed, but none solidified into accusation. The museum resumed limited operations, though Gallery 4 remained dark. Somewhere beyond its walls, the missing objects were being arranged, studied, and understood in a way the museum had not intended. The theft had not ended. It had merely shifted into its next phase. The second object came back without warning and without ceremony. It arrived in a padded envelope left inside a public locker at a commuter rail station, discovered only because a transit employee noticed it had remained unclaimed for several days. Inside was the carved whistle with the cracked mouthpiece. No note accompanied it. No identifying marks were added. The only deviation from its original condition was a faint residue along one edge, a mineral dust not native to its documented region. Investigators began treating each return as a data point, rather than a concession. The timing, location, and method of reappearance were mapped with the same rigor as the initial theft. The returns were not random. They formed a loose geography that traced movement along secondary transportation corridors, places busy enough to obscure activity, but peripheral enough to avoid scrutiny. The choice of sites suggested someone attentive to flow rather than destination. Forensic specialists focused on the residue found on the whistle. Analysis pointed toward a specific type of limestone, uncommon but not unique, associated with a narrow band of quarries and natural outcroppings in the Central Plains. It was not enough to pinpoint a location, but it narrowed the field of environments where the object might have been handled. More importantly, it suggested that the artifacts were being kept together, at least temporarily, in a space that left its trace behind. As more objects returned, a pattern emerged in their order. The first had been the needle, a tool associated with repair and continuity. The second was the whistle, an object tied to signaling and sound. The third, delivered 2 weeks later through a courier service paid in cash, was a trade bead, worn smooth by handling. Each return seemed intentional, sequenced according to a logic that was not immediately apparent to investigators, but felt deliberate all the same. A breakthrough came from an unexpected quarter. A graduate student specializing in material culture contacted the museum after noticing the order of returns mentioned obliquely in a professional forum. She proposed a hypothesis rooted not in criminal behavior, but in ethnographic structure. In several cultures represented among the stolen artifacts, objects were grouped not by function or value, but by role within a life cycle narrative. Tools of making and repair came first. Objects of communication followed. Items of exchange and movement came next. If the hypothesis held, the remaining artifacts would be returned according to a progression that mirrored human transition rather than museum taxonomy. Investigators tested the idea against the list of missing items. The next logical return would be a fragment associated with travel or boundary crossing. When, days later, a small stone charm tied historically to river passage appeared taped beneath a park bench overlooking a canal, the theory gained weight. The thief was not improvising. They were following a script. Attention returned to the photographer, not as a suspect in the conventional sense, but as a possible observer who understood narrative through imagery. His background revealed a period of independent study in visual anthropology, a detail previously overlooked because it did not fit the profile of a criminal accomplice. He had not profited financially from the theft. His accounts showed no anomalies. When questioned again, he denied any involvement with increasing firmness, yet his descriptions of the objects had grown more detailed, as if distance had sharpened memory rather than dulled it. Investigators resisted the urge to act prematurely. There was no direct evidence linking him to the removals or the returns. More importantly, the sequence of reappearances suggested that intervention might interrupt a process still unfolding. The museum, reluctantly, agreed to a strategy of observation. Each returned object was documented and secured, but no public announcement was made beyond what was unavoidable. Silence, they hoped, would allow the pattern to complete itself. The remaining artifacts began to arrive more quickly. A utilitarian blade fragment left inside a book drop. A small ceremonial weight placed carefully on the steps of a closed library. Each return adhered to the emerging order, moving toward objects associated with culmination rather than initiation. The thief was accelerating, either by choice or necessity. With only 3 items unaccounted for, the investigation reached a tense clarity. The final objects, according to the life cycle framework, represented closure and separation. Items linked to burial, abandonment, or transformation. If the sequence concluded as predicted, the last return would not be casual. It would require a setting capable of holding symbolic finality. Investigators reviewed locations tied to endings rather than transit. Decommissioned sites, places no longer in use but not yet erased. The limestone trace narrowed options further. One location surfaced repeatedly in internal discussions. A former cultural center built atop a quarried ridge, closed for years and awaiting redevelopment. Surveillance was established discreetly. Days passed without movement. Then, just before dawn on a fog-heavy morning, activity registered at the site. A single figure entered and exited within minutes. When officers approached, the building was empty again. Inside, arranged carefully on the floor of the central hall, were the final 3 artifacts. They had been placed in relation to one another, forming a shape that echoed a motif present across multiple cultures represented in the collection. The arrangement was precise, reverent, and complete. The theft was over, but the meaning of it had only just come into focus. The arrangement inside the abandoned cultural center was documented before anything was touched. Investigators photographed the objects from above, from the perimeter, and at eye level, preserving not only their placement but the negative space between them. The shape they formed was not decorative. It was instructional. When curators later overlaid the configuration with archival diagrams, the alignment matched a teaching model used in multiple societies to explain the passage of knowledge across generations. It was not a ritual scene, it was a lesson. The building itself provided the final context. Decades earlier, before it became a cultural center, it had housed a regional archive devoted to community anthropology. The archive closed quietly after funding cuts, its holdings dispersed to universities and museums. Some materials were absorbed into collections. Others were never fully integrated. Their provenance recorded, but their interpretive frameworks lost. The museum targeted in the theft had inherited several of those items, cataloged accurately, but stripped of the connective narrative that once bound them together. The thief had not stolen objects from the museum. They had reclaimed a story that had been dismantled by institutional efficiency. Investigators returned to the photographer one final time, not with accusation, but with evidence. The sequence of returns. The life cycle framework. The choice of the final site. Presented together, they described a motive that no longer needed speculation. The photographer did not deny involvement. He did not confess in the conventional sense either. His cooperation took the form of clarification. Years earlier, while assisting with a small exhibition at the now-closed archive, he had helped document a privately developed interpretive model. It was designed to show how ordinary objects carried extraordinary continuity when understood relationally. When the archive shuttered, the model was deemed too abstract to preserve. The objects were saved. The framework was not. Watching those same objects later displayed in isolation had felt, to him, like a misrepresentation, not incorrect, but incomplete. He used his access not to profit, but to reassemble the model once more, physically, temporarily, and without damage. The museum had never lacked the information needed to understand the connection. It had simply never been forced to see it whole. The theft was the only way he believed that could be achieved. Charges were discussed and ultimately reduced. The objects had been returned intact. No security system had been compromised beyond existing permissions. The legal system treated the case as unauthorized removal rather than grand theft. The photographer accepted the consequences without resistance. The museum made no public acknowledgement of the underlying intent. Official statements emphasized recovery and security improvements. Internally, however, the impact was lasting. Gallery 4 reopened months later with revised displays. Objects once shown alone were now grouped differently, their placards rewritten to emphasize exchange, adaptation, and continuity, rather than origin alone. Visitors lingered again. The case closed without ceremony. No manifesto was published. No interviews were given. The story remained largely contained within professional circles, where it was discussed not as a crime of greed or defiance, but as a boundary violation born of conviction. What had been taken was not value, it was context, and what was returned finally was understanding.